We talked a bit yesterday. I'm Bob Polson. It appears that it is 7:30, so 7:30 Eastern Standard Time. Welcome. To introduce George. Just a couple of things to say. George, we're very happy to have you here today, of course, which I hope I say again and again. George is the director. Oh, wait. First of all, George, you want to introduce your guest?
Yeah, very welcome. And thanks very much for inviting me. I first came to USA as a 19-year-old student, and I basically went from New England to Florida to San Diego to Vancouver and in between, and it was a very maturing experience. So I'm not sure if all my 6 guests are here, but basically we've got 3 who are living in USA and 3 who are living in UK. So to start with the Rotarians first, Sue Pipe. She's the Secretary of Colchester Centurion Rotary. I talked to them about a month ago about family history, and she said, I'm interested in your Mayflower talk. When are you doing it next? And hence you very kindly invited her. Ian Shaw is a member of our own Kilmarnock Rotary Club, and he started a very successful E-Club recently, which has American members. And then there are my relations. Tom Patrick and Tom Holliday live in America, but they also descend from Richard Warren of the Mayflower and from Philip Delano, who came over the year after. And William English, who lives in Kent. I'd say later on, someone came back to UK in late 1700s. And so he's a 3rd cousin and has got a lovely farm in Kent, which I'm sure he'd be delighted to show you around at some time. And then Alex Fleming, I'm not sure if he's involved, but Philip Delano was unusual because he actually came from Flanders rather than England. Alec Fleming has run a very successful Scotland and the Flemish people project the last few years. He's a Scot, but he lives very close to you, has for many years in America, and was in world banking. So delighted to introduce them to you. And in fact, a couple of them I haven't met myself. So
let me say a couple more things about you, George. I'll just do this quickly. George is a director of Family Service Research Through People. He is also Secretary of Kilmarnock Rotary Club. George has many years of experience of genealogical research in the UK and the USA and other parts of the world. 2020 is the 400th anniversary of Mayflower, the voyage that changed the world. George has an ancestor, Richard Warren, who was a passenger on the Mayflower in 1620. His talk today covers the events during the Reformation, which led to the Pilgrims leaving for the New World, the voyage itself, and the impact of the Mayflower voyage on Western civilization. George, please take the program. Continue.
Okay. Well, many thanks, and so delighted to be here. Just give me a moment. Hello. Gosh, how great of you to come and welcome us. My word, that voyage, I never want to do that again. Someone says you come from a place called Virginia. Is that right? I come from a country called England. You may have heard of it. My word, it's been some few years. We were living in this wee village in Nottinghamshire in the middle of England, minding our own business. I mean, my family had lived there for generations, and we were very staunch religious Puritans. And we weren't too happy about the way the Church of England was going. So someone said, we need to separate from the Church of England, which was quite something. And then someone said, why don't we go over to Holland? So a bunch of us went over to Holland. We've been there for about 10, 12 years. And it was a mixed experience because they were nice people, but they spoke Dutch, not English. The church we went to spoke French. The kids were growing up more Dutch than English. And there was a war looming. So someone said, why don't we go to this place called the New World? So it took weeks for us even to get started. But we've been over 2 months coming over, dreadful conditions, people sick, storms, and so on and so forth. So we really, really, really are glad to see you. 1620 is a year I will never forget. Sorry, one moment. What? It's 2020, not 1620. So these people live in this place because they know what happened to us. Oh, I'm sorry about that. But I do that partly because to me, this is a very human story. It's people like you and I who were caught up in events, and some things went for them, some things went against. And like all good stories, there's a before, a during, and an after. And in fact, there were 2 big events happened more than 100 years before the Mayflower, which caused the events that happened. So what I'm going to do is start off with a short video about the Mayflower, which hopefully gives you a flavor for that if you've not done. And we'll test out the share screen here. Let me just see if...
Hey.
Get the sound up a bit. See the right?
Yep.
Good.
Got it.
Right, so I hope that gives you a flavour. And I guess there's a mix in the audience. Some of you know a lot about the Mayflower, perhaps have been to Plymouth Plantation and so on, some not very much. So what I've actually put together here is the before, during and after. And some of the things I'll go past quite quickly, perhaps, but afterwards we can explore things more fully. And I expect a lot of you have got things to actually add to that. So as I said, the before, during and after human story. So what I'm now going to do is use a slide presentation to explore that in more depth. So I hope you can all see the screen. Yeah, okay, good. So let's look at Europe in the 16th century. And you'll have heard of the Reformation that happened then, which we're going to go into. Now, some of the countries were the same there. There was England and Scotland were there, but there was no United Kingdom. France was more or less the same. There was no Germany, there was a German Empire. What we now know of as Belgium and Holland weren't there. There were 17 provinces known as the Netherlands or Low Countries. They were actually ruled by Spain. Now, the most powerful country from the point of view of religion then was Italy. Virtually the whole of Europe was Catholic, not just Catholic, but Roman Catholic, because it was controlled by the Pope from Rome. The most powerful country in Europe was Spain, who actually not only had Spain, but they ruled the Spanish Netherlands, and they went to South America during the 16th century, brought back a lot of wealth from there. Now, the first big event that affected the Mayflower was Christopher Columbus discovering the New World in 1492. Some of you may know he was actually an Italian, paid for by the Spanish government, And I rather like the thing that said when he went, he didn't know where he was going. When he got there, he didn't know where he was. And when he came back, he didn't know where he'd been. So they just called it the New World. And that would provide the pull, if you like, for the Mayflower pilgrims. Now, in Spain, Charles V was the king, one of the most powerful monarchs in history. And basically, Spain had two monarchs through the 1600s. Charles in the first half, his son Philip II took over. England had similar. Henry VIII was ruler for about 40 years and then was followed by Elizabeth. And in between, there was Edward and Mary. Now, the second big event that affected the pilgrims was in 1517, Martin Luther nailed up 90 theses to the church door in Wittenberg, protesting about some of the Catholic practices. For instance, if you've been a naughty boy or girl, you said you were sorry, paid $50, and you got a chance to get back into the kingdom of heaven. He didn't like that, so his ideas spread. Even more influential was John Calvin, and he set up in Geneva in Switzerland, and gradually these ideas spread throughout Europe. By and large, Southern Europe stayed Catholic, Spain and Italy. A lot of northern countries went Protestant. We find in a moment that actually England went Protestant, not really anything to do with religion, but because the king wanted to get rid of his wife. And then we get the second half of the century. Philip II's taken over from his father, Charles V in Spain. Elizabeth has taken over in England. She tried to steer a middle way so that it wasn't as constant Catholically Protestant. And that's eventually what led to the pilgrims, Puritans, strict religious people, to think, we don't like this, we want to separate. And it wasn't just from England, they were from the Midlands of England, and even a part of Nottinghamshire, a small part. There were two communities in particular that were the basis for the people who would go to New England, known as separatists because they wanted to separate from the Church of England. They went across to Leiden in Holland, which was then the second biggest city in Holland, and eventually 1620 went over on the Mayflower. And the reason we talk about it this year, it's the 400th anniversary of that voyage. So let's look at England in more detail. So Henry VIII is king. Now, you know, when you read a novel and you think that's a bit far-fetched, well, one or two aspects of this is Henry VIII was married to Charles V's aunt, Catherine of Aragon, didn't have any male sons by her, so he wanted to divorce her. Charles V was not happy about that. But basically, he split from Rome because Rome would not allow him to divorce her, so he could divorce her and turn the country Protestant as it happened. Now, I mentioned these refugees in the 17 provinces of the Low Countries. They reckon the Spanish killed 50 to 100,000 Protestants. So naturally, a lot of them fled. Henry allowed them to settle in England. Eventually, he did have a son, who, of course, was very young when he became king. Edward was just 9. And so the country was run by protectors. These strangers coming in, they spoke Dutch and French. So eventually they set up strangers' churches with services in their own language. Edward dies only age 15, and he's followed by Queen Mary, known as Bloody Mary because she turned England Catholic again, and there was a lot of fighting and bloodshed. And ironically, she marries Philip II of Spain. He could have become King of England if she hadn't died quite soon after. Followed by Elizabeth. And as I said, she tried to steer a middle way, took England Protestant again. The Spanish Armada you'll have heard about. Philip II again sent the Spanish Armada. If that had been successful, again, maybe he'd have become King of England. But eventually the King of Scotland became King of England. James VI of Scotland became James I of England. Now, he banned private religious meetings, which was the catalyst for the separatists finally to say, we need to go somewhere else. We celebrate Guy Fawkes Day, Gunpowder Plot, just done that. Again, a Catholic plot. Religion was a very big factor in those days. So let's look at the separatists in more detail. They were Puritans, a strict religious people. They wanted to separate. Ideas gradually developed from the 1580s. And here's the bit of England where they came from. There were two congregations, Scrooby, Gainsborough just over into Lincolnshire, and a number of places have significance, and a number of people as well. Clifton was a very powerful preacher in Babworth. I'll say a bit about Bradford, Brewster, and Robinson in a moment, but two congregations were the core of what all of this became and what happened. They held secret meetings because they weren't allowed to meet in public. They separated from the church in 1606, fled to Boston in Lincolnshire, after which, as you know, yours is named, but they got betrayed. They couldn't go then, but the next year they succeeded. They went across first to Amsterdam in Holland. Now, these three key people, William Brewster, he was born in Scrooby. He lived at Scrooby Manor. He allowed that congregation to meet at the manor in secret. He went to Leiden and he came across to Plymouth Colony. The pastor, the religious leader, was John Robinson. He had been in Norwich, where there were both Dutch and French refugees. And that's possibly where the idea grew, let's go to Holland. He was dismissed by the Church of England because his views were different, went back home. He went over and became pastor in Holland, but he stayed there. And in fact, he died not that long after in 1625. And William Bradford, you can see, born in 1590. So he's just a teenager when all of this is developing. He goes over to Holland and to Plymouth and became governor for much of the first 30 years. He wrote a book of Plymouth Plantation, which is the main reason we know as much as we do about what happened over there. So the separatists are over in Holland. The reason they went there was those provinces that we now know of as Holland declared independence from the Spanish back in 1581, and it gradually became more peaceful, so people could go there. The separatists arrived in 1609. They worshipped in the French-speaking Walloon Church, and more followed them in years that followed that. But they got jobs very poorly paid. There was hardship. Children were growing up more Dutch, and yet another war between Holland and Spain was looming. So the decision was taken to go to New England. Now, we talk about the saints. Actually, only about half the people on the Mayflower were religious pilgrims, known as the saints. There's another group called the strangers, which I'll say a bit about in a moment, because this trip needs to be paid for. And they didn't leave on the Mayflower. They left on a ship called the Speedwell. Again, there's a story there. But let's look at what was happening in the New World. Once it had been discovered, various European countries, England, Holland, Spain, and so on, tried to colonize. So Walter Raleigh, you'll have heard about. Now, he was in Roanoke in the 1580s. He brought back a staple part of the Scottish diet, the chuck and tobacco, but that failed. King James gave permission for colonies to be set up. Jamestown in 1607, only 20% survived. So in 1620, there had been no successful colonization. Now, interesting enough, the name New England first came about when a Captain Smith sailed up and down the East Coast and called that part New England. And he also gave the name to New Plymouth. I'd always thought Plymouth was named because that's where the Pilgrims left for. But in fact, it was named just literally 4 years before the Mayflower sailed. And so here we are in 1620. And here's the journeys that they took. And interesting enough, the calendar's changed by 10 days. It's gone back, etc. But if we take the current calendar, the Pilgrims are over in Holland. They left on the 1st of August. On the Speedwell, the Mayflower actually came from London because to finance this, they got a company of merchant adventurers based in London to finance it as an investment. They hoped that things would be brought back from America like beaver skins and so forth. Those who went either became indentured as servants to people who were going or agreed to work a certain number of hours on behalf of this. So that helped to finance it. The Speedwell comes in Holland and it was a disaster. The Speedwell and Mayflower met in Southampton, but the Speedwell leaked on the way over. They set off, leaked again. They went into Dartmouth for repairs. They finally got out about 300 miles beyond Land's End before the sailors said, there's no way we can take this ship across the Atlantic. So they came back to Plymouth, and that's why they left from Plymouth in mid-September.
I got it on here.
Now, they're almost exactly 6 months wrong in time. If you're going to go to a place where there's no housing or something, you want to arrive in spring, early summer. But this is mid-September, so they're going to face some bad times, as they think. And as we've seen in the video, there's the ship. I guess some of you have been round the Mayflower too. Small, half the passengers of the Speedwell went on the Mayflower, and half said, we're not going across, got left behind. So it must have been very cramped down there. You know, only 5'6" height. If you were tall, you couldn't stand up straight. Most of the passengers spent most of the time down there. They faced the trade winds coming and the Gulf Stream, storms, seasickness. It must have been dreadful. And finally, yesterday, in today's time, 19th of November, actually the 9th of November in history, they sighted land. But they're 200 miles north of where they should have been near the Hudson River. So the tensions on that ship must have been dreadful. Two different groups of people Things have gone wrong. They've had 2 months of hell. And someone said, look, we've got to live together. We need to draw up a blueprint of how we'll live our lives. And they drew up what's become known as the Mayflower Compact. And read some of the wording here. Combine in a civil body politic to enact laws and so forth, as from time to time shall be thought most meet and convenient for the general good of the colony. So no king or queen, no president. We're going to run this for ourselves. So, of course, they set off exploring, but it's mid-November already. Winter comes in. They elect one of them, John Carver, as governor. He dies in the first spring. And William Bradford, I mentioned earlier, he takes over as governor for most of the next 30 years. Now, they had some information from previous migrants where they could get food from in the fields and forests. Of course, there were fish, but there were also people living there, native Indians. Early December, there was an attack with arrows by natives. Fortunately, it didn't come to anything. And then again, it fascinates me how luck plays a part in life. So Christmas Day, they walk around the corner. There is an abandoned native village. The local Indians were called the Wampanoag tribe. And ironically, with COVID-19, they had had 3 years of plague. And compared with now, they wouldn't have had a clue what was happening or what to do about it. This whole village was something like 80% of Wampanoag, they reckon, were wiped out by the plague. But at the same time, the Pilgrims had problems. About half of them died in that first winter from disease. Scurvy was a problem on ships then. Starvation. 66 days. I don't know how much food they took, but they must have run out of some things. And then another bit of luck. One day, an Indian walks into camp and speaks English. Squanto spoke English, and the reason was he'd been captured as a slave, taken over to England where he'd learned English, and eventually managed to make his way back. But it meant they got a means of communicating between the Wampanoag and the Pilgrims. They drew up a treaty between them. And of course, the Wampanoag were familiar with the local territory. So they said, right, if you're going to grow corn, what you'll need is fertilizer, use dead fish. I don't know if any of you are agrarians, but apparently that's what the soil's like in Plymouth, as opposed to back home where the Pilgrims came from. Now, I think this is a very sobering poster. The black are the people who survived from the Mayflower. The others are those who died. So we get the situation where the whole families survived, but also whole families died. Others, there was a mixture, etc. But a dreadful journey. And then you get that with people dying around you. They must have been so pleased to get through to the next summer. Now, I mentioned that I actually had an ancestor on the Mayflower, Richard Warren, and he's an ancestor of the two Toms and William as well. Now, he went on his own. He was married with 5 young daughters. He left them behind, not knowing if he'd get across or ever see them again. They actually went over 3 years later, which turned out to be a very good decision because he'd survived. They came, they had more children. There are probably more than 1 million descendants from Richard Warren. Now, if you knew me better, you know what a natty dresser I am, and you can immediately see why. Actually, very frustrating because, of course, I met the actor playing Richard Warren in Plymouth Plantation, but he knew nothing after 1627. I couldn't even say I'm descended from you. Now, as you know, as Americans, a lot of people would like to be descended from someone on the Mayflower. They reckon about 50 of the passengers got descendants and have done a lot of work. So I like to think I'm an expert in family history. I didn't need to do anything apart from go on the internet and find the two Toms, William and me, have some quite famous distant cousins. Henry Longfellow, the poet, 2 presidents, Ulysses Grant and Roosevelt, Ernest Hemingway, the writer, Orson Welles, the film producer, Alan Shepard, the astronaut, Richard Gere. Now, why he got the looks and I didn't, I personally think is very unfair, but I can't do anything about it. Now, the youngsters, of course, pay no attention, but of late I've got some street cred because apparently a pop singer called Taylor Swift, you're too old to know who she is, but apparently she's quite famous. She's a relation as well. Anyway, enough of that. Our other ancestor, Philip Delano, he went over on the ship the next year, the Fortune. And what's interesting about his Delanois ancestors, virtually everyone on the Mayflower was English, but no, the Delanois actually came from Flanders. There they were, Torquay, quite near Lille is probably the city you might know. Actually, interesting enough, it's now in France, but it was then in Flanders. And they fled from Spanish persecution to England. They spent about 12 years in Canterbury in England, just as the separatist movement was getting underway. And they went to Leiden in 1591. 18 years before the separatists. In fact, the separatists must have been delighted to meet people who actually spoke English and had also lived in their country. And as I say, 1621, he went over to New England on the Fortune. So let's look at what happened next. Now, Thanksgiving Day, you don't need me to tell you this, but a lot of Brits don't know it. The first one was in 1621, literally having survived, grown their corn and so forth in the autumn, they harvested, and they had this meal, 3 days of celebration. Something I only found out quite recently, there were 90 Wampanoag at that first Thanksgiving. The basic relationship between the Wampanoag and the Pilgrims was very good up front, and it showed there. 1863, Abraham Lincoln declares a national day of Thanksgiving. You don't need me to tell you that it's next week. And here we go, I'm told, you gather for a day of feasting, football, and family. And you'll know all about that. So gradually they build the houses. The Fortune comes over the next year, another couple of ships in 1623. That's the year they divided the land up between the various people who were there. The merchant adventurers, essentially they bought them out in 1626. They actually took cattle across. There were no cattle on the Mayflower, there were 2 dogs, but they took cattle across, so they divided them up between people, and gradually the Great Migration starts. Lots of people from lots of different countries, leading to the first successful colonization of that part of the world. So you'll be familiar with this territory. Eventually there are 13 colonies down the east side, and a very small part really of what is now the USA. Color coding here, so pink is where people got to by 1660, yellow is by 1700, and green is 1760. So Bailey's Crossroads, they would have got there in the late 1600s. Religious freedom, a lot of people came across from different countries, and trade and commerce, tobacco, cotton, various other things grew up. Now, there's this statement, the most influential journey in Western history. We could debate that, but you have to say the next 400 years, a lot of things have happened. And just to pick out a couple of things, I'm not going to go into the next 400 years, but of course, people come from various countries. Now, I do family history, and the fascinating thing looking at America is you have so many different types of surnames. There are 4 main types, and if we take the presidents of America as examples, there are local surnames based on places. So Bush, those people probably live literally near a bush in their village. Washington and Lincoln are places in England. Relationship, John's son, Jefferson, Wilson. Occupations, Carter, Taylor. Nicknames, Truman, Grant or Grand. And I had a quick look at your names. And so you've got names that are these sort of categories. And then, of course, you've got lots of other names that are clearly not from Britain. And that's the state in America, isn't it? The mixture over those centuries of people come from all parts of the world. Now, I live in Scotland, and I thought I'd just briefly say this example. The Act of Union between England and Scotland happened because of the Mayflower. Well, it happened because of the successful colonization that happened. Scotland had tried to colonize. In the 1690s, they had a disastrous scheme in Darien and Panama, almost bankrupted the country. So 1707, the Act of Union is proposed, and the Scots signed up quite quickly, providing they got access to the English colonial markets. There was an immediate economic boom. Now, if any of you have been to Glasgow, this is now the Gallery of Modern Art, but this was one of the houses that one of the tobacco lords built, very much in the Roman style. You can see the statue in front is of the Duke of Wellington, and 30, 40 years ago, someone stuck a traffic cone on his head, and I think it's now in law just about, he must have that headgear all the time. The police used to remove it, but next morning, he got his hat back again. And then, fantastic bonus, the Industrial Revolution starts soon after the Act of Union, and it grew and grew. And 1850, the United Kingdom had over 40% of the total world's industrial capacity. Then you guys caught us up and overtook us. But if you look at, Glasgow's near here, Glasgow's population went up by more than 50 times between 1700 and 1900. Now, the other thing that happens, of course, over time, that the Pilgrims spread out and all the rest of it, I, with my family history, normally I'm researching back in time, but of course the people have lived here. So just a quick sort of bit of flavor here. There's Taylor Swift. There's my ancestor and Tom and Williams, Henry Delano, who was the one who came to England in the 1780s. I don't know if you can see any similarity between those two, but basically their ancestors, Mercy Warren and Alice Warren, were the sisters. you can see just a year apart, they must have been very, very close. But if you look down the way, basically Taylor Swift's ancestors went to other parts of Massachusetts, and then they went across to Connecticut, whereas our ancestors went down the coast to New Bedford and eventually across to Nantucket Island. And in fact, Henry Delano was a whaling master. In the War of Independence, there were a lot of Quakers on Nantucket, and they weren't popular because the Americans thought they were being disloyal, and the English kept sinking their ships. So after the War of Independence, a London-based whaling company said, why don't we try and recruit some of these whaling masters from Nantucket? So 90 whaling masters came across to England. 2 of Henry's brothers came across, they went back, but he stayed, and hence we're here. And here a bit of geography. So here's Plymouth. So basically Taylor Swift's ancestors went south, but ours went to Dartmouth and then across to Nantucket. But then eventually they go across to Connecticut and of course start spreading out, as do our ancestors in all ways. Now, of course, celebrations were planned. They actually started at the end of last year. Various places in England where the pilgrims were related to and where the voyages came. There have been TV and radio programs, and of course you planned this. And what's excellent, the Wampanoag are very fully involved in the celebrations. But as you know, in March, there was a bit of a halt. Now, one of the things, the Mayflower 2, in the 1950s, we built a replica of the Mayflower 2 with input from America, mainly as a thanks to you guys for participating in World War II. And it's had a major 3-year refit round in Connecticut. And in August, it sailed under full sail back to Plymouth. There are videos online you should go and see, a magnificent sight under full sail. But of course, that's put in hold. And so basically, a lot of events have been planned or postponed and are planned for 2021. I thought I'd just finish with, I mentioned earlier on of Plymouth Plantation. How do we know what happened? Now, Edward Winslow is the only pilgrim of whom there is a portrait. And he very soon after wrote a couple of works, 1622, 1624. But the key document is this of Plymouth Plantation. So Bradford actually lived to his 80s. There's this thing, some use may be made hereof in after times, but others in such like weighty employments. Now that was passed down William Bradford's family. It ended up in the meeting house in Boston during the War of Independence, where there were British soldiers, and it disappeared for 70, 80 years. And then in the 1850s, someone was reading this book written by Wilberforce, who was the brother of William Wilberforce, who campaigned for slavery. And he said, this sounds like of Plymouth Plantation. Where did Wilberforce get this from? And they found it in the Bishop of London's library in 1855, having disappeared for almost 100 years. And eventually it was returned to Massachusetts in 1897. And I thought I'd just end with what the person from Massachusetts said at this thing. I do not think many Americans will gaze upon it without a little trembling of the lips, a little gathering of mist in the eyes. The building of the state on those sure foundations which no wave or tempest has ever shaken, the breaking of the new light, the dawning of the new day, the beginning of the new life, the enjoyment of peace with liberty. Of all these things, this is the original record by the hand of our beloved father and founder. So I hope you found that interesting. As I mentioned, I do family history. Very happy if any of you want to get in touch and seek some help. I've been making videos of late you can find online, and I give a 10% discount to Rotary members. But thanks very much for listening. Very happy to take any questions that you have.
Okay, let me make a suggestion. Thank you very much, George. That was a great presentation, of course. Anyone wants to have a question, first of all, take yourself off of mute. And secondly, I recommend you put yourself under chat. Tell us you have a question, because I can try to see everybody, but it's hard to do that.
George, I see Mac.
Yes, I just had a question.
Lisa, Roger, and Bernard.
Was Richard Warren a saint or a stranger?
He was a merchant.
So he was a stranger.
Essentially, yeah. I mean, of course, we don't know a lot about these people. You know, he married in Hertfordshire, just north of London. They found literally quite a few years, 20 years ago, not fairly recently, the will of his wife's father that's given a bit of information, but that's about all we know.
Thank you.
I have a note from William English. He said he has something to show. William, go ahead.
Hello, sir. Thank you very much for inviting me and as a relative of all this. This is the original of the picture that George has just put up. I don't know if he knew that I had this in the drawing room, but this is our American ancestor, Henry Delano, who was the ship's captain, who came back to England in about the 1780s. And he married, well, certainly my great-grandmother about 6 times back, and bought a place in what is now in the middle of London, really, but then was a farm and became Tottenham football ground later. But anyway, this is Henry. He looks a bit American. I'll just see if I can get the light to show you. But that's quite a cool picture, and it's a great honor to be with you today. So thanks very much.
Okay, thank you very
A
much.
question, Robert?
Sandy? Sandy,
Question.
go ahead, Sandy.
I wanted to ask you about the connection between the Delano family and Franklin Delano Roosevelt.
Yep. He's a descendant. In fact, I've done a lot of research on the Delanois in recent years. It's quite interesting. Well, basically, about 100 years ago, 2 brothers wrote a book, and there's a lot of good stuff and a lot of other stuff. There was a claim about royal descent, which I've proved, unfortunately, is not true. But yeah, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, he's a common relation down about 3 generations. That essentially his people, he had whaling masters as well in his ancestry, but you know, the name Delano tells it all. Roosevelt, they came from Holland, but essentially, clearly, he stayed in, but they went round to Fairhaven with our ancestors, and then his brother stayed there, whereas our guy went over to Nantucket. Does that answer
Thank
your...
you.
Nisa, you're next.
I didn't have a question. Thank
Okay.
you.
Roger, did you have a question?
Yes, I was wondering if you would comment on our recent attempt to rewrite this history.
Could you speak up?
I didn't have any comment coming from overseas on our attempt to rewrite history, i.e. the 1619 project, which in my humble opinion is ersatz history, but we're trying to rewrite this on the basis of this country was founded totally and completely on slavery, and there's really nothing else that matters. If you're familiar with this.
Does anyone hear that?
It's about rewriting history. I'm not sure when or what topic.
The 1619 project.
The 1690 project is
The Darien scheme?
1619. 1619.
The Darien scheme?
George, Roger's referencing a recent thing in the United States that there is a project called the 1690 project, which is trying to 1619 project, which is talking about when the American history actually began. And some people think of it as rewriting history.
Right. Is this sort of to do with the Native Indians were there before 1619 and that sort of thing?
Well, it's kind of based on the notion that this country was born, built, motivated entirely by slavery.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Okay.
There's a bit of problem for us for a long time, but it's kind of agenda-driven history. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but
I mean, the 2 things I'd say is obviously the Native Indians, for instance, had been there long before. I have a thing in what I want to do in life. I want to be informed, I want to be objective, and I want to be balanced. So, of course, it's right to think it isn't just that there's the white people who went across, there were Indians there beforehand, the slavery and so forth. And to me, there's so many different things on all sides. What does frustrate me sometimes, you get someone putting just one point of view from an uninformed, an informed basis, but a very unbalanced basis. And I mean, an intriguing thing I know we were talking about, say, take Jamestown, Indians killed some of the white people. Plymouth, there was a good relationship at first. New Amsterdam, New York, the Dutch bought that land. There are various factors. America over the last 400 years has grown to be the wealthiest country in the world, which obviously lots of people benefit from. And so there's a whole range of things, slavery clearly is a bad thing, etc. So what I like to do, by all means, we should revisit history, we should add to it, we should build on it, we should get rid of what is wrong. I'll stop there because, we're all having.
Bern or Kathleen? One of
Yes,
you
it's
have a question.
Kathleen. Hello. Your talk was really wonderful, Mr. English. Thank you. I just want to ask you, when I was a child, my father always told us we were descended from somebody who came over on the second trip of the Mayflower. And he never mentioned any name. And I don't know, is it really true that the Mayflower made a second trip? And how could one find out who these passengers were, or how could I possibly find out who perhaps is the family ancestor that my father was talking about? I mean, it sounds a little bit complicated, but it would be interesting. Was there a second trip, and is there a list of passengers?
I mean, two things. The Mayflower itself did not come back, but there were other ships called the Mayflower. But the Great Migration, lots of people came across. Now, General Society of Mayflower Descendants. There is a society. They have, every state has one, and they have, of the 50 pilgrims who had descendants, they've got a book with detailing perhaps 5 generations down from each of those people. So that's now the challenge for you is, can you get back up in time using someone like myself or what have you to link with that most recent person? The other thing, there is actually a project called The Great Migration Begins, and there's a lot of information about who was on various ships and so on and so forth. So it depends whether what was something, but a lot of people have that sort of discussion. So in other words, the generations coming down from the Mayflower are quite well documented. The key for you is to get back in time and see if one of them is one of your people.
So is there a website for The Great Migration Begins for people who are looking on other ships? Is there a website or something? Or
yeah, there's a guy, Robert Charles Anderson, who's excellent in this thing. So yeah, if you Google those sort of things, I'm sure you will find it. If you ask, the General Society of Mayflower Descendants.
The Mayflower Society. That is, yeah. Okay.
Yeah. And they call them the Silver Books. So, for example, this is Richard Warren's Silver Book. I bought that. That's got 5 generations of his descendants.
Yes, and I know there was one who was born on the Mayflower. I guess when it first came, Peregrine White is a very famous Mayflower, survivor. Peregrine White, he lived along, but I don't know,
Yeah, well, actually, say a couple of things about that. Yes, there was a child born on the Mayflower, and they called him Oceanus. Idea. Peregrine White wasn't born on the Mayflower, but was a son of William White.
He wasn't actually born on the Mayflower. Okay, thank you.
And Oceanus actually died, unfortunately. Someone died. There was a guy who actually fell overboard. He caught a rope, and the sailors managed to get a boat hook and drag him back in. His name was John Howland, and he's now got more than 1 million descendants who wouldn't be here if.
Dennis Shannon has a question.
Hi, George. The question I have is, when you mentioned half of the passengers were Puritans looking for the religious freedom, what was the composition of the other half of the passenger manifest?
Yeah, I don't know much. I mean, basically, this company of merchant adventurers helped to fund the trip, and I guess most of them came via that. Quite easy when you look at a map of England, where people came from. Mainly it was the Midlands and the South, and obviously there's Scrooby and Gainsborough in the Midlands. But as someone said, actually in 1620, they weren't involved. It was London and Holland, and most of these people came from the south and eastern of England. And it's not a lot is known about many of the pilgrims before they left. Some that there's a bit, etc. So there's a range of people. Richard Warren was a merchant, but that wasn't the reason he went necessarily. So there are individuals I could tell you about, but there's no pattern, I think. And obviously somehow they got into it. I mean, everyone was quite religious in those days, in a sense. It wasn't as though they were the other side. But so only a partial
Stephen
answer.
Wasco has a question.
Yeah, George, thank you very much for your presentation. I used to teach history at one point, and you know, being in Virginia here, Jamestown's very, very big to us. And so there's some controversy as to whether Jamestown was the first permanent English settlement versus Plymouth, for example. But my question actually refers to, I had heard, and I just was wondering if this is true, that one of the reasons the Pilgrims actually made landfall was they had run out of beer. Is that true? You're on mute, by the way.
George, you're on mute.
Okay. Okay now? Yeah. Well, what I do know about beer is, yes, that they drank beer on board rather than water because the beer had been processed, whereas the water was potentially dangerous. I could, 66 days, they wouldn't have planned for that, I don't think. So I would think probably they would have run out of beer and they were probably very upset. Yeah, but I mean, debate, James, of course, these things are debated. And what we've got here, of course, is there's a heck of a lot we don't know, because it's so long ago, etc. Thank goodness for Old Plymouth Plantation and so on. Then, of course, there's various different aspects. I think one thing that life teaches you is we've all got different perspectives depending on our background and so on. I mean, picking up that and previous question, I've been lucky enough to travel around the world quite a lot. I've been to Australia, New Zealand, etc. I've been to places where colonization has happened. Is colonization all good or all bad? Somewhere in the middle, isn't it? But there's a whole bunch of factors, and depending on your insight, if you're the Indian living in the country or the Aborigine, your view is different from the person coming in, and it's quite right that we bring all of that together, and the actual interpretation you make will depend a lot on your own background.
George, is there much
information
information about the Viking travel to America? I mean, I've heard they came much before Christopher Columbus. I don't know if that's true or not. Have you heard much about Viking trips to America?
I don't know. I mean, the Vikings certainly did incredible. I mean, it's been dreadful. You just set off, no navigation aids and so forth. You've no idea what will happen. But, they certainly went to a lot of places. I don't personally know whether they got as far as America or not, but certainly possible. But no one wrote it down. In fact, picking up Stephen's question, one reason they say that the Mayflower perhaps got more publicity than Jamestown is Thanksgiving Day. There was this event, which eventually has become what it has today, which reminds people all the time of the Mayflower. And certainly, more settlers, 50% were successful rather than 20%.
Which, if I may debunk that one, 1619 was the first Thanksgiving in Virginia. So, there's a whole thing about who's first and that sort of thing. So it depends on what you want to believe.
Absolutely.
Let me jump in and say something just quickly. A lot of people have to leave, so what I'm going to do is take two more questions officially in the meeting, but people could stay. We'd be happy to stay if George is able to stay and talk to you a little bit after the official meeting, if that's okay.
William English had something.
Go ahead.
All I was doing was saying to George, my cousin, which I can do, that he'd been on mute and his answer to Stephen had not possibly processed. And so I'm saying, wind the clock back a touch and just the question over Jamestown versus Plymouth. No, pre that, George.
What was it?
Plymouth versus Jamestown. Who came first?
No, I think if Stephen says there was,
I think we answered it already.
1619, there was a Thanksgiving 1619. It's an extra fact which adds to what we know.
Kathleen has her hand raised again.
You're on mute, Kathleen. We can't hear you. Kathleen, you're on mute.
Okay, thank you very much. This question is a little bit to the side, but I am fortunate that my mother was born and raised in the northeast of Scotland, and if it hadn't been for World War II, my parents wouldn't have met and married. But I was just wondering, Mr. English, where actually where do you live in Scotland? What part of Scotland?
I live in Ayrshire on the west coast, about 25 miles from
Yes.
Glasgow. But I was born in Kent, quite near where William lives down near London.
Yeah,
But
I
as
see.
an adult, I came up here. So certainly happy to research your Scottish ancestors for you if you would like.
Oh, it's not necessary. They were on the same property from the 13th century to the 20th century. Let's put it this way: the 20th century finished them off. It finished them off, and they're no longer there.
Adam, did you have a question? You had your hand raised. Well, Dennis said you wanted to talk. Dennis, you're on mute.
Yeah, George, I have a question about the quality of the records, because I can see the ship manifests, but after that, when they finally get to Plymouth, and there's no government, there's no newspapers, and is it an oral tradition of passing down who you're related to, or the family Bible records this? How is that traced back to that point?
Yeah, briefly, there were, other people, I mentioned just Edward Winslow, but a number of people started writing things, etc. There were records sent back. The actual sort of birth-death records are quite good. And the Mayflower Descendants Society has done a tremendous job in finding whatever is there. And then, of course, people later on, interpret and all the rest of it. Books basically written by people, aren't there, who study things, facts and a mixture. Word of mouth, yes. And basically, it's fantastic what we know, but there's a heck of a lot we don't know.
I just want to say thanks for coming, because this was really a great presentation you made. I really appreciate that. Thanks a lot.
Yes, thank you very much.
Thanks very much.
I'm going to, please stay with us, George. I'm not officially in the meeting, so people can go, but.
Okay, happy to do that.
But if you could stay, I think we'll have a lot of people that want to stay.
Yeah, no, I'm delighted to enjoy this.
Okay, please stand for the four-way test and join me in saying what they are. Of the things we say or do, is it the truth?
Is it the truth?
Is it fair to all concerned? Will it build goodwill and better friendships? Will it be beneficial to all concerned? Okay. Thank you for coming to the meeting today, and please stay if you want to talk a little bit extra. And let's see, Curtis, if you need me to take a host, okay, I'm a host now. That's fine.
Yeah, taken over as host.
Yeah, okay. Anybody else have some more questions for George?
Actually, it's not really a question so much, George. I see Sue's still here. That's good. I've actually done some ancestry tracing myself. Unfortunately, I don't have any relatives that came over on the Mayflower or anything like that. Mine didn't get here until the 1890s or so. But what I do have is I have one of my descendants who was actually a mayor in an English city, Stockton-on-Tees.
All right.
Goldston, Gerald Goldston. Yeah, so that's my claim to fame. I'm sort of going the other way, I guess.
Well, Wasco is certainly not an English surname.
No, it was on my mother's. It was on my mother's side, and they were Jewish actually. So.
Okay. Anybody else with questions?
Holcomb has something.
Oh, I see. Jim, go ahead. You might be on mute. Otherwise,
somebody mentioned about the Vikings. There's a book about 20 years ago called Cod, and they said the Vikings probably around 1,000, but the trade route was concealed because they were after cod, and they didn't want anybody to know the best route because of commercial reasons. And the real question I have is, I saw the Mayflower, George, in your background when you started. I was one of the lucky people in the 50s that saw the replica in Jamestown in the 50s. Was that a caravel? You know, the old Spanish ships with the lantern sails and the power rectangular sails and the rudder in the back, the
Wow.
steering bar. Well, do you know anything about the ship?
Not a lot. I mean, the ship I showed was actually the Mayflower 2 this year, my background. But, and as you say, 50 in the 1950s. And it's, I guess one or two of you actually been around the Mayflower 2. And what strikes you is how small it is, I think.
Yes.
So, no, I'm not an expert on shipping. So,
George, I have another question. I'm going to bend your ear once more. Do you have a position on these companies like Ancestry.com and 24andMe and when they have this DNA assessment? Because, for example, in our family, my daughter wanted it for Christmas, and so we sent it out and it came back. And my daughter is 70% Irish, which pissed off my wife, who's Cuban, you know, because part of that's her. And so how accurate is this stuff really in your experience?
yeah, I mean, keep it brief. I mean, it's tremendous. The amount of information that's now available online. You know, I can research around the world because of things. You know, I write reports sometimes. I think, well, even 10 years ago, this is 5 times what I could have done there. DNA has been a very big plus in that it proves a relationship. The sad thing is, you hardly ever know who and where the person was unless you trace back in time. And you know, if somebody goes back 1,000, 2,000 years, and we came from Africa and various places, so it can be useful. I find it quite useful very often to make contact with someone where there may be a relationship. And what's particularly interesting is sort of it's getting back 200 years, 300 years, reasonably okay, but before then it's difficult. And DNA has certainly thrown up certain things. Now, perhaps I shouldn't say this, but I went to, you may know that in 1066, the French came and took all the land in England. And the first 200 or 300 years were French kings. So in fact, I was there in France, and about the 1400s, all of the kings of England were actually buried in France. And apparently this king was born 9 months after his father had been away fighting for 3 months somewhere in Europe. The implication is that doesn't seem to fit with things. Now, I don't know if the royal family are ever going to take a DNA test. But yeah, it can be useful, in other words, but it's not the whole thing.
Nisa, did you have your hand raised? Clyde, go ahead.
Yes. George, I think you mentioned that the wealth of Scotland was greatly increased by a tobacco trade. Is that correct?
Yeah, a lot of it in Glasgow, yeah.
Okay, so that the capital that was stored up from that tobacco trade, was that a significant capital input to the Industrial Revolution development in Britain?
Well, gosh, again, another enormous subject. I mean, Glasgow became the second city of empire. It was the one that expanded upon more times, etc. The wealth certainly helped. And what's fascinating is, again, people, but you know, various people contribute. I mean, James Watt, you may have heard of, who was a Scot. Now he did various things. Because of the United Kingdom, he actually linked up with an Englishman, Matthew Bolton, and had the world stage to play on. So what's great, I'm a great believer in synergy, 2 and 2 make 5, teamwork. You know, various things have helped, you know, obviously the Scottish wealth. Yeah, a lot of coal, iron, steel, those sort of things developed around, a lot of industry, shipbuilding and so on and so forth. So, you know, the mixture of capital and enterprise and various other things helped. And it's fascinating with America, isn't it? Because 1850, there's United Kingdom. You guys have caught up and overtaken, again, with various people doing things. You'll have a view on that as well, Clive, no doubt.
Well, what I was pointing at was that, you know, that would be how I mean, the wealth that came from tobacco in Scotland, you know, is wealth that came from slavery in the south of the U.S. And so the wealth that came from slavery in the south of the U.S. I don't know how much of that went into developing the Industrial Revolution, but I like to think that some of it was productively employed in building up the industry in Britain.
Yeah, I mean, slavery is a big topic. It's bad, isn't it? I think it's a question of trying what part, you know, how big or small was it? But there's without question, you know, cotton's another thing, etc., that was involved in that. So you know, and so was enterprise. So was a whole bunch of things. I mean, it's intriguing looking back in history and forming judgments now, isn't it? I mean, I descend from a slave.
I think we all are.
Well, Henry Delano was a slave. There are about 10 million black slaves out of a million white. He was captured off the coast of Africa and held for something like 5 years, and he got away. What annoys me is modern slavery. You know, we have nail bars and things. And anyway, you know, it's a big topic, isn't it? And
Okay, one thing I have to say is I've got to leave in a couple of minutes. And Dennis, I'm going to make you the host, so you can just close out the meeting if that's okay. But go ahead. Any more questions?
I have a question.
Go ahead.
It's kind of a follow-up to Dennis's questions on both record keeping and DNA. Are groups like the Mayflower Society starting to accept DNA findings as part of the proof process? And you referred to the 5-generation project, so I'm very familiar with those works. But the problem for a lot of people is the proofs from the late 1700s to the early 1800s. So that's where genetic evidence will prove the link to known ancestors in the 5th or 6th generation. But they haven't, you know, if you don't have the written documentation, and you won't get it because they didn't have it in certain parts of our country. Is that evidence now being accepted as part of the proof process?
I think, it says I'm not the right person to ask. I think the answer is yes and no. I think by and large, more no than yes. I mean, I have some professional comments on the way they go about things, etc. I'm well, the good things they do are fantastic. I think there's an evolution there. I think, you know, it's a difficult one to get your mind around DNA. To what extent should that play a part? But what's good is it's certainly a piece of evidence that should be part of, but how best, and we could debate.
Thank you.
So, Janetta?
Yes. Mr. English, I just wanted to say thank you so much.
George, it's all right. I'm not.
Oh, okay, George. Thank you so much for your presentation. It was really interesting because it's more than just a history lesson. At least for me it is, but for you it's your family history. So I really appreciated you just coming and sharing that history with us. It's really valuable.
Good. I mean, it's a thrill for me to come and do this to an American audience.
Okay, Max, unmute yourself. Max. Okay.
All right, sorry. I have a question. I have done a lot of my own genealogical research in the United States, and I have a very large file. But my difficulty has always been going back to Europe. I can do work here in the United States, but when I reach the ancestor that came from Europe, it ends. Is that something that you can focus on?
Yeah, I mean, basically, email me and I'll have a look.
Most of my ancestors came from England, although not all of them.
Yeah. I mean, maybe, you know, I know that England, Scotland, Wales, Ireland very well, other European countries less well. But the simplest thing is to, if you've not, get an email address for me and just send what you have, and I'll give you a view on that.
All right.
Alex, you need to unmute yourself if you're into.
Yes. Well, excellent.
Good to see you anyway.
Yeah, good to see you, George. Excellent presentation. Just to let everybody know, George did recommend to me a good book to read about the Mayflower. But one of the things that amazed me about the book was that maybe only about 10% of it was about the journey and the initial, you know, landing and so on. Most of it was about the relationship with the Indians. And you mentioned that it was quite a good relationship to start with, but then it deteriorated very significantly. I mean, do you have any sense of, you know, how many people were killed and by the Indians, and, you know, how serious this deterioration was?
I think two things to say, but so Alec Fleming, he's the Scot who now lives, you're about, what, 20 miles from Bailey's Crossroads?
I mean, I'm in Maryland, yeah, I'm up in Potomac, Maryland. Mm-hmm.
Anyway, and he ran this Scotland, the Flemish People Project. I think, I mean, King Philip's War, I guess all the Americans know about, was about 40, 50 years later when the, real conflict and so on and so forth. I don't personally know a lot of detail, but yes, it deteriorated in various ways. What I find quite interesting about that map I showed in 1760, just how small a part of America, particularly it was when the white man went west, that there was a lot of conflict with Indians and so on and so forth in various ways. And, slavery is mentioned. I mean, there's a whole bunch of issues that, and deterioration, it's intriguing in a way, isn't it? Because obviously we focus on that. I'm particularly pleased how well the Wampanoag and the Pilgrims got on in the first place. I don't know. I mean, well, something totally different. I had an ancestor who in Australia was killed by the Aborigines. If you're the native people, whoever comes to your land, you don't know whether they're friend or foe. Now, I don't know enough to answer your question, but there must be quite a lot of that sort of thing happened. Well, and again, the Americans here will have a much better idea of where America is now and the mixtures and the melting pot, I think, is an excellent expression of just how many different origins, cultures, and so on make up USA.
Thank you.
Clyde here again. I want to give a reality check. Not everybody notices that there's a big difference between indigenous cultures and the European cultures. The indigenous cultures of Australia and of America have these tribes of people who see the land as community property, whereas the Europeans come in and they want to have individual ownership of the plots of the land. And when they take individual ownership, they're taking it out of the community property of the indigenous people. And so, of course, you have conflict.
Yeah.
True.
I've got an indigenous point. Indigenous to Kent. We had a king in Kent once. George and I were just discussing a bit before this, and if anybody is over and down my way, then you're always most welcome to give me a shout. And there's a lot of history that's related to Canterbury, which is about an hour to the east of where I am, down in the bottom right-hand corner of England, and reasonably close to the French coast. So if you're ever down that way, then give me a shout, and always happy to link up with hands across the ocean and all that. And I know that if you wanted to get really cold and had a really big coat and wanted to go up to where George lives, I wouldn't go up there, but he does. Then you're most welcome to try some polar Arctic expeditionary gear. You've got it over where you are, so good luck with that. Alexander Fleming is the same territory. So anyway, but if you want the warm, sunny climes of Kent, come this way.
I work for a Florida-based company, and one time the new phone book came up, and on the back page it said, "Please brush the snow off your doorstep" in Florida. And apparently the advertiser in the north had fallen out or something, or the south. So it was actually the Wisconsin version that had got down to Florida, where snow was less common. But yes, it does happen in Scotland, doesn't it, Alex?
Lastly, a quick sort of thing. George has done a lot of work on my own family history. And if any of you are privately really interested, George doesn't know I'm going to say this, but he's really good at this stuff. And it is a great way of linking up where you are to any history you've got over on the UK side, probably anywhere else too, but I can only talk about the UK stuff.
Sue, I've actually got a question for you. How's Rotary going on in England right now?
Well, it's mostly by way of Zoom. Luckily, we can still keep in contact with each other. But one of the things we're finding hard, and I was going to ask you how you're doing it, is fundraising. I mean, we've helped the community. We've been doing sewing for the NHS. We've been sewing scrubs, laundry bags, etc. And we've been helping with the food bank by giving our subs that we would normally spend on breakfast to them. But we're just finding it hard to actually fundraise rather than put the money in ourselves. And that's one thing we are looking at. So I don't know if you've got any ideas and anything that you're...
Well, you know,
Ian Shaw's also in the Kilmarnock Rotary. You might like to answer that, Ian. And you unmute yourself. Unmute yourself.
Ian, you're still on mute. There you go.
That's it. That's better. No, I'm not sure I can answer because we have the same difficulty with fundraising. Having said that, I've got a comment to make from what George was saying earlier on. He says this was the first time he's spoken in America. I would like to say that the more you do in America, George, the better it is for us because we don't have to listen to you quite so much.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, George. Hey, George, I arrived rather late. I was tied down by my wife. Not literally, but tied down by my wife.
Well, getting back to the original question about fundraising, our club, for the past 35 years, we've raffled off a classic American automobile, a 1965, 66 timeframe Ford Mustang. I don't know how familiar you are with that particular vehicle, but you know it's rather popular here, that time frame specifically. And the year I was president, which was 2017, we raised the most money we'd ever raised ever. And then 2 years later, my wife was president and she broke my record without trying. But that was really good because when she was president last year, and when the COVID started around March, a lot of the charity projects that we do in the community, we shifted a lot of that to focus on food insecurity and made large donations to several local food banks with a lot of the riches that we had. Then we also did a lot with the monies we still had left over from her Rotary year fundraising, push that toward this year's, so that because with the big thing with our Mustang raffle is we're out in the general public. We're going to wine festivals and car shows and that sort of thing, and you're interacting with the public. So we just couldn't do that. Not only from the fact that a lot of the localities are putting clamps on how many people can gather, but you know, some of these shows and things are getting canceled, and you know, it's hard to interact with the public. The car makes it real easy. In fact, while I'm talking here, I will change my background real quick. This is the car that we had, you know, last year. Beautiful convertible Mustang. And again, we raised over $180,000 with that. So, you know, what we've tried to do a little bit of fundraising through, because we will collect people's names and addresses when we do the car here. So we actually sent an appeal letter out to them this year asking for, hey, we're not going to do it this year. We hope to do it next year. We've already got the car. It's great. But, you know, can you make a donation? And that's not been as successful as we'd like it to be. We've gotten some response to it, but yeah, the fundraising piece, quite honestly, has been, I think that's probably going to be a major hurdle for all Rotary clubs, probably.
Yeah, that's our membership. But how do you get the card? Is it something that you buy?
Well, you know, like I said, this has been going on for 35 years. Always a different car every year. And so we have a group that actually goes and finds the car. They'll go on eBay, oldcars.com, I've seen him go to the obituaries looking for a Mustang, but once we get it, we actually had, up until this past year, we had a mechanic who was a member of our club who would actually, we'd buy him the parts and he'd do the labor for free and he'd fix it up and make it look great. And it would look like it came off the showroom floor. So, you go and $25 a ticket, 5 for $100. And we would sell from around the beginning of April to the end of September. And again, like I said, you go to car shows, wine festivals, places where the public is, and they have some disposable income. And, it's like I said before, it's a great way to get out to the public to not only talk about Rotary in general, the good works that Rotary does, because we'll have a sandwich board there that shows various charities that we support. And we're blessed. Let me just be quite honest. We are blessed by this raffle because of the amount of money that we make. And the mantra that I had my year was, it's not how much we raise, it's how much we can give away. So, so we would support things like the local food banks, like I said, the local school system, Wounded Warriors, for example, literacy projects, water projects, there's pets, animal shelters, that sort of thing. So there's a vast network of organizations that we're supporting. And as you're talking to somebody, they may not be a car person. They don't care about the car, but they look, it's like, oh, well, you support this organization or that organization. Well, I like them and it's a donation. So I'll give you $25. And if I win the car, great. Okay. Then you've got other people who are the big car guru people that look and they're like, because like I said, we fix it up. It's like, well, gee, you realize you've got 1965 wheels on a 66 car, and they'll take their cell phones and they'll take pictures underneath the car going, oh yeah, you did paint that piece that most people forget about, so it's one of those
Johnny
things.
Cash not sing about that?
Say again, George?
Johnny Cash had a song, didn't he, about the...
Yeah. That's the funny thing. We go to these car shows and they're playing the same songs over and over and over. And Johnny Cash had one about, he stole a car one piece at a time.
That's right. One piece.
He was working at a factory and he would put a piece of a car in his lunchbox when he'd left every day. So I don't know how many times I've heard that song over and over and over at these car shows, but like I said, it's one of those things. It's for us. We've done very well with it. Over 35 years, we've raised over $2 million gross for Rotary projects and in general public charities, and that's great. But now we're starting to think a couple things. One, maybe we need to do something else, because you get young people and they look at this thing and they're like, where do you plug in my phone? There's no place to plug in the phone. There's no airbag. There's no seatbelts, stuff like that. Whereas their parents are looking at it going, yeah, we could tell you stories about this car, that sort of thing. So, so the question gets to be, when do you change your fundraiser? The old saying is, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. But if something comes along, like COVID, for example, and you can't fundraise the way you previously fundraised, you've got to think, maybe we need to think about different methods. And, we sell online, and that brings in about 30 to 40% of the revenues. But then you've got, the other 60 to 70% is literally standing out next to the car in the hot sun, talking to people about the car and saying, hey, in fact, one of the people that's still on this call right now, Ian Charles, I see him right there. He is been one of our top sellers almost since the day he walked in the club. This man could sell ice to an Eskimo, you know? So, you know, so there you go. I'll get off my soapbox now.
Can I just ask for what the clubs in the UK are doing as fundraisers at the moment, just to get an idea of we're always looking for new ideas. Anybody could speak to that?
Do you want to, George? Do you want to, George, or shall I?
Tom Holliday and Tom Patrick, my guess. Are you able to unmute and can we see you?
Yeah, they have to unmute it. Yeah.
Can you carry on?
Of what we do for fundraising, various clubs have been experimenting with online virtual events, whether it be a balloon race, a cat or a dog show, or that sort of thing. It doesn't raise great sums of money, but it helps to ease the pressure that is on members to contribute, because that really is probably the way most clubs are surviving at the moment in terms of helping people financially. There are many clubs who are making PPE, making masks, that sort of thing, but not too much in the way of fundraising. Fundraising is small quantities. It's probably £500 to £1,000, something like that. I don't know, $700 or thereabouts, $700 to $1,000. But it's a real problem because you can't approach the public.
Yeah, right. Do you know what other clubs are doing? I know everybody's kind of doing something online. For example, we have these virtual races and marathons and walks and bike things and all, and I don't know how successful they are. I just see the pitches coming in of people just trying to do stuff, but it is frustrating because we've been. Matter of fact, we have a meeting tomorrow to kind of brainstorm on how we're going to make this work. I mean, people want to. They know what we do. There's no mystery in what we do, but just getting them to help us do what we do, because we know how to do things certain ways, and we're trying to convey that. I mean, I think one of the things that we had a pitch from. We had a mail out. And the idea we had to design the mail out as a plea for money to people is, and then this really is true, that we know the good operators and we know how to get things done, instead of designing the letter saying, well, this food kitchen, you know, we supply to them. Well, we didn't want people to make an end round us and go right to that food kitchen. You know, we wanted to be like the facilitator in it. And it wasn't as successful as everybody hoped it was, but it's still a mystery out there. There has to be a club or a bunch of clubs somewhere that are finding a way to do it, and we just haven't found that yet. You know, because the other thing that it's kind of weird that the pleas from the international are the same. Like, we're making the same money as before. They haven't seemed to find a way to adjust their pitch to us, but we're having, you know, still trying to find a way to make this thing work, you know. That's the frustrating part.
I'm gonna have to go in a couple of minutes just to.
Yeah, it's all virtual events and it's all small amounts, but there's so many organisations calling for money, so it's hard.
I know. Yeah, I can walk from my house. So there's a temporary shelter that they took over as a hotel. I could use American thing, hit a baseball and hit it. The need is much more demonstrated. I'm sure it is over there too now than ever has been. And it's frustrating is because when we thought we were rolling in dough last year and the year before, we're not nowhere near it, and we're fighting something that's even bigger. So that's the whole frustration. But George, thanks a lot. I really appreciate this. I'd like to keep in contact with you.
Yes, thank you.
I'm gonna hit you up with one more question. I'm gonna cross that line in the sand. This is about politics. but in the 90s, I spent about 3 weeks over in Edinburgh, and there was a big thing about the breakaway. You know, they want the Scots wanted their own, bigger say in their own country and stuff. And with Brexit going on, the little bits I've been seeing, that is coming to the surface again. So what's the latest on that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, gosh. Actually, when I talk about being three things: informed, objective, and balanced. Because clearly, these situations, there's pros and cons. The trouble with politicians, they tend to only give you one side of it. I mean, for instance, economically, the United Kingdom has been fantastic for Scotland. They've contributed a lot and they've gained a lot. And at the same time, of course, there are very strong arguments for nationalism and not. And, I like to have a debate like we've raised lots of topics today where there's pros and cons. There's no doubt that at the moment that it's a live issue. And Brexit's intriguing because it just so happened Scotland slightly went not for Brexit, whereas England slightly went for it. Again, I could say things. If I was Europe, when that vote was taken, I'd have said, oh, let's change a couple of things and let's go back to Britain and say, let's sort that out. And it's not, but anyway, we are where we are. The way politicians act is not something that necessarily I would recommend. And I could go down your country line as well, couldn't I?
Yeah, right.
But no, it's a live issue without question.
Okay. Well, all right. Well,
it's been fantastic. We really enjoyed it. I hope my guests have, William and Tom, and the two Toms I can't see. Sue, good to see you again.
Yes, nice
thank
to
you,
see
Sue.
you again.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, William.
And Ian's looked after those flowers for months now. I know that.
Yeah, it's just the back garden. It's the view from my window, as you see.
Pretty good.
And they grow all the year round like this. It's amazing. Never change though. Even the petals don't fall off. But what can I say?
Yeah, great thing about petals not falling off, right?
Good to speak to you, Ian. Good to see you.
Cheers.
Steve.
Thank you. Thank
Two
you.
Toms. Shame I can't see you. Anyway, really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Right, thank you. Okay.
Bye. Bye, folks.
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks,
Bye.
see you from
Thank
Ken.
you.
I'll be the last one off. So.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Nice to see you, man.
Nice seeing you too.
Yeah, just keep coming back.
All right.
All right. Take care.